Hey everyone, and welcome to another video on this channel. This time we are going to take a look at Bicep, and this is a getting started level video. First of all, what is Bicep? Well, it's a tool to automate the deployment of infrastructure on Azure in this case. So you can compare it with other tools like Pulumi, Terraform, Farmer, and of course other clouds and other environments have their own tooling as well. If you've done some automation in the past with Azure, you probably have heard of Azure Resource Manager. So now we're going to use Bicep. Does that mean it's bye-bye Azure Resource Manager? Well, of course not. Azure Resource Manager is the system that makes everything work, so to speak. Whenever you create a resource, update a resource, delete a resource, Azure Resource Manager and its APIs are the magic that makes that all happen. So we're going to use Bicep, but we're still going to have Azure Resource Manager in the background. So no, it's not bye-bye Azure Resource Manager. So okay, ARM is not gone when we start creating Bicep files, but it surely is bye-bye to these pesky ARM templates we created in JSON. Well, not entirely, because when you create a Bicep file, it has to be compiled to an ARM template, and then it gets submitted to the Azure Resource Manager APIs. Now you can do this compilation step manually, or you can let the tooling do it for you in the background. So in essence, you should see Bicep as an abstraction on top of these ARM templates. So they're not really gone yet. Now, why would you even use something like Bicep? Well, reason number one for me is certainly the simplified authoring experience. The Bicep files are just simpler to write than these JSON ARM templates that we had to write before. Especially when you start doing things with expressions, it starts to become obvious that this is the way to go. A second reason is that it's much easier to reuse code with modules in Bicep. It's really made for that as well, somewhat similar to how Terraform does it. And you don't have to throw away everything you know about ARM templates and the ARM system in the backend, because in the end the Bicep file, as already discussed, just compiles to a standard ARM template. And by the way, there's also a method to decompile an ARM template into a Bicep file. Your mileage may vary depending on the complexity of the ARM template that you decompile, but it surely is a great way to get started with some existing ARM templates that you have lying around. Before we get started with an example, what tools should you use? Well, first of all, and that's a no-brainer, to author Bicep files, just use Visual Studio Code with the Bicep extension. There's also the Bicep CLI, which allows you to compile these Bicep files to ARM templates to then submit these ARM templates to the Azure Resource Manager. But you don't really have to do that because the Bicep CLI is integrated within the Azure CLI 2.20.0 or later. It's directly supported, so in the -- template file parameter, you can just specify a Bicep file. And the tooling for you will do the compilation step and then submit that to the Azure Resource Manager in the backend. We'll look at a more complicated Bicep deployment in a moment, but for example, if you want to deploy something like a storage account in Azure, it can be as simple as what you see here on the screen. You just create a file with the .bicep extension, and then you start with the resource keyword. After resource, you specify the symbolic name. That's not the name for the resource in Azure. That's the name that you use to reference this resource within the Bicep file. For example, to retrieve properties of this resource and use them somewhere else. Now, of course, you have to tell Azure Resource Manager what kind of resource type you want to provide. So here you see the resource provider first, that is Microsoft.storage, and then within that provider, we deploy the resource type storage account. Now, sadly, there's no way today, at least that I know of, to specify that you want to use the latest API version at the time of deployment. On the other hand, it might benefit you to be precise. So in this case, you have to specify the precise API version that you want to deploy. And that's it. Then you just use an equal sign, and then between these curly braces, you provide all the properties that a storage account expects. That's all fine that you have to provide the properties that the storage account expects, but where do you find that? Well, of course, in the Microsoft documentation. So if you go to Azure Templates, you can go to all the different resources and resource types that you can deploy. And as you can see here on the screen, they now not only provide you with the JSON format for the JSON templates we used to create in the past, but you also get the Bicep format here. So there you find everything that you need to deploy the resource. Enough talking, I'd say. Let's get our hands dirty and let's deploy some Bicep templates, in this case using Azure DevOps. Before we get started, a big shout out to the Microsoft Cloud Native Global Black Belt team, which had a session called Configure Your AKS Cluster with Confidence. And in that session, they used Bicep deployments to deploy AKS and also have all the best practices included in those Bicep files. Let's look first at what we are going to deploy here. I'm inside a file called main.bicep, as you see here. That's just a convention. You can call the file anything you want. After the declaring of some or the declaration of some parameters, I have my actual resources that get deployed. Now, just like the example you saw with the storage account, we create a resource with the resource keyword, give it a symbolic name, and then of course refer to the Microsoft resource provider and then the actual resource type. So in this case, Microsoft.network/virtual networks. Remember, the symbolic name has nothing to do with the actual name of the resource in Azure. That's where the name property comes in. Next to the VNet, we also deploy an AKS cluster. Now, we don't directly deploy the cluster from a resource keyword. We actually use a module we created before. So we use a module here, give it a symbolic name again, AKS, and then we refer to the module here in this folder, modules folder, AKS cluster.bicep. A module is just a Bicep file. There's nothing special about it. You don't have to use specific keywords and so on to make it a module. Any Bicep file can be used as a module. Of course, a module typically will have many parameters defined, so you only have to supply the module with the parameters that your module expects to create, in this case, of course, the AKS cluster. And if you know something about AKS, you probably see many properties here that are required or maybe recommended when you deploy such a cluster. Next to AKS, we also deploy Azure Container Registry. Not with the module this time, just directly with resource, symbolic name, and then in this case, Microsoft Container Registry/registries. In the end, we also want to provide some access rights to the container registry. What we do here with this resource is that we assign a role to an account, in this case, the managed identity of our AKS cluster, and we assign that account the ACR pull role on the ACR resource here. You can see that, by the way, scope is ACR. We just reference the resource that we want to set our role on. Before we start deploying our Bicep file, let's look at parameters. And of course, you'll use parameters to make it flexible to deploy whatever you want. Now, defining a parameter is very easy in Bicep. Just use the param keyword, the name of the parameter, and then the data type. You see a couple of data types here. Strings, of course. You can use arrays as well. There's a bool type, and there's also a int type, for instance. Yeah, and in some cases, we initialize our parameter with a default value. So if we don't supply the parameter when we do our deployment, that default value will be used. What you can also see here is that parameters have something which is called decorators. So here, for example, you see the ACR skew parameter, which is a string with the default value of basic, but I only want to allow 3 different values there. So there we use the decorator called allowed, so at allowed, and then as a parameter to that allowed decorator, we specify an array of allowed values. Note that in Bicep here, this array, you don't have commas between the different values. There are other decorators as well, such as min length and max length, and of course check the documentation for other decorators that are supported. Now, how do we use an actual parameter in our deployment? For example, how do we use this ACR SKU when we deploy ACR, Azure Container Registry? Well, very simple. If you go to the bottom, you'll see it. Of course, our Azure Container Registry has several properties, as you can see here. Well, there's a SKU property, which actually has a name property, and there we use our parameter called ACR SKU. It's as simple as that. Now, of course, we work with modules as well, right? So we deploy AKS using a module. That module is here in AKS cluster Bicep. Now, if you look closely at AKS cluster Bicep, yeah, there's nothing different about this. It's not that different from main. It's just a Bicep file. And the module, of course, also has several parameters defined. Typically in a module, of course, you want to be very granular. You want to allow a lot of parameters because, of course, you want to reuse that module in many different situations. And here, for example, you see also an example of a parameter of type object. And here, for example, we use this for several of the AKS settings that we will supply later on when we do the actual deployment of our AKS resource. And of course, you've probably already seen that in our main Bicep, for example, we have a parameter like prefix and suffix. Well, the value of that, right, so that probably you'll have to supply that at deployment time. The value of this can be passed, of course, to parameters of our module. And you'll see that here, when we call the module AKS, the module expects all types of parameters. Well, the module parameter prefix, we give that the value of the parameter of main called prefix. In Bicep, it's also quite easy to use functions. And especially in Visual Studio Code with command line completion and so on, that makes it really easy. For example, suppose that for the location of my VNet, I want to use the location of my resource group. And the resource group I'm deploying this Bicep template to. Well, of course, I can do control space, or I can think that it might have something to do with a resource group. So I just type res. And here I see indeed that we have the resource group function. So we can click on resource group. Indeed, it's a function. And then we can just specify a dot and then select what we need from that. So in this case, we want the location to be retrieved. And that's all there is to it in this case, with a very simple function to retrieve something dynamically in your template. There are also quite some differences in how operators work. Things like and or and multiplication, division, and so on. I'm not going to show that. You can find that in the documentation. But I do want to show you the ternary operator a bit here. For example, here, for the name of our VNet, we want to change that depending on whether a parameter is supplied. So in this case, if VNet name equals an empty string, so that's how you test for equality, right? So two is signs. Well, if it's an empty string, then we are going to construct our name, our string, using the parameters prefix and suffix, and then the word VNet. Here you also see an example of string interpolation in effect as well. So inside a string with single quotes, you can just use that dollar and curly braces to include your other parameters or variables, for example, to create a new string. In case the VNet name was supplied, we're going to use the VNet name as the name of our resource. Okay, time to deploy the Bicep file, but we're going to use an Azure DevOps pipeline for this. I won't explain in detail how Azure DevOps pipeline works. Suffice it to say that this pipeline defines some variables at the pipeline level. So I have a variable group defined in Azure DevOps. This is where I get something which is called the SSH key, and I need that because that is used to connect with SSH to my AKS nodes. So that SSH key is set at the Azure DevOps level. But for example, the location of my resource group is just set in the pipeline. And this connection is a reference to a service connection in Azure DevOps that contains credentials to connect to my subscription in Azure. So that was defined within Azure DevOps. You don't see that here, but you should create that, of course. Otherwise, you can't connect to your subscription. Then at the job level, I'm just going to have one job here. At the job level, I define the resource group I want to deploy to, and also define my parameters file. Now here it's important that you're using this @ sign here. So it's just a string that you use to refer to the file, but you have to put an @ sign in front of that. So remember that. Now the actual steps that I want to run to do the deployment are defined in a template pipeline. So that's a child pipeline, so to speak, in the common folder, deploy AKS. So here in deploy AKS, you see the steps. We have only 2 steps here, a checkout step to check out the source code. That of course contains all these files over here, including my main.bicep. And then the preferred way of deploying a Bicep template is to use, for me at least, to use an Azure CLI task. The recent versions of the Azure CLI will be used to deploy this template, and they support Bicep files directly. I'm not going to go into all the details, but of course Azure CLI expects what kind of Azure subscription do I run against, and that was that variable that refers to my service connection within Azure DevOps. We're just creating an inline bash script. The bash script does the following 3 commands, and that's all there is to it. I'm not going to explain the ACR role, but I need that to get a role ID, and when I have that role ID, I can supply it as a parameter to my Bicep file. We create the resource group here, and we use indeed the resource group parameter, which is defined at the job level, and the location parameter, which is defined at the pipeline level. Then we do as deployment group create. We specify the resource group, of course, in this case, because that's what our scope is. We didn't set a subscription scope or something like that. And as template file, we refer to our main Bicep directly, of course, relative to where my pipeline is, which is deploy_dev. Yeah, it's not relative to the template that we are in at this point in time. Now, to set the parameters, I have to set 2 parameters individually because I retrieve them in another way, right? So the parameter ACR role, of course, I refer to the ACR role variable that I use here, and the parameter admin public key is using the SSH key, which is defined at the Azure DevOps level. But all the rest, because we are deploying a cluster into our development environment, I have specified indeed a parameters file which refers to the development variables. So for example, if I go back to deploy dev, you see indeed that we refer to Bicep parameters dev.json. When I go to parameters dev.json, you'll probably be surprised because indeed this is a JSON file. This is the same file that we use, the same type of file that we use to define our values of parameters with ARM templates. That hasn't changed yet. But here, of course, we specify all the parameters that my Bicep script, my Bicep template expects, like the Kubernetes version, the prefix, the suffix, how many nodes I want. In development, I want 1, but maybe in production, I want more. VNet prefixes, the subnets I want to create inside the VNet, and so forth. And as you'll see in production, indeed, it's a little bit different. There you see another suffix, and you also see that we only deploy 2 nodes instead of 1 node. Right? Now let's try and deploy this in Azure DevOps itself. So here we are in Azure DevOps. I'm in a project called AKS Bicep, and I'm in a repo called AKS_Bicep. And of course, these are the files that you have seen me working on in Visual Studio Code. If you go to the Bicep folder, you'll find the main.bicep file over there. As you have seen as well, if you're going to the root of the repo, there's my deploy dev.yaml. So that's a pipeline I've shown you earlier. It does use a somewhat different template. This has an extra compile step as well. What is this compile step? Well, basically, just for fun, I added a build Bicep template option here as a separate task that builds the Bicep file. For example, if there are issues or errors, they will be seen there, and pipeline will stop at that level. Now, okay, of course, this pipeline was defined as a pipeline at the Azure DevOps level here in the pipelines. Yeah, how do you do that? It's quite simple. You say new pipeline, there's a wizard that's coming, and then you refer to the YAML that contains your pipeline. So in my case, you can see that in the deploy dev pipeline was recently run, and it was run successfully. The other one, apparently for some reason, did not run successfully. Now, this pipeline does not have an automatic trigger or something, so it has its trigger is none, so I have to run this myself manually. Let's run this and see what happens. So I'm gonna click on this pipeline, all the different runs I had in the past. I played a bit of pipeline bingo to get it right, of course, as we all do, I expect. And now we just click on run pipeline, and then you use the run option. So let's run this pipeline and see what happens. So the run starts. It's only one job, as you have seen inside the pipeline, deploy AKS dev with Bicep. If I click on that, we'll see indeed that we now get an agent, an Ubuntu latest one. It's acquiring that from the cloud, and now we start doing the actual deployments. So in this case, he's doing the checkout. He's now building the Bicep template. That is successful, so that means that my Bicep file was correct. And now, of course, the deployment starts. Now, that will take a couple of minutes, so we'll pause here and see what the result of that is. And it took about 4 minutes to deploy our Bicep template, because that's give or take 4 or 5 minutes what it takes to deploy AKS. Let's take a look what happened in the portal. So here we are in the Azure portal, where we see our deployed Kubernetes service. If you go to the resource group, we see all the resources that were deployed by the Bicep template. So 5 resources in total. And to show that these are just ARM deployments, you can just go to the deployment section here and take a look at deployments and what they did. So I have my main deployment that's coming from my main.bicep file. I didn't specify a name for my deployment, so the name of the template is being used in that case. If I click on main, there you, for example, will see that we deployed our virtual network, our container registry. We did a role assignment as well. The other deployment is the deployment of the AKS cluster that we did via the module. So in the end, regular Azure Resource Manager behavior and deployments. And this concludes the video about Bicep. If you have questions, please do drop them in the comments. Thanks for watching. Bye bye.